Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March 18th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in again. Such eventful times we are living in. You know, that Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. It certainly has sort of boiled down on us because it seems like 1 week passes, 1 week doesn't pass without any kind of major news or major stories or major events coming out. I decided I'd speak today about two kind of places that have that are in the news all the time. But before we get to that, maybe I'll just very quickly take a few mentions about the state of affairs, and of course, the start of the war in Gaza again. Really was something that was very predictable, because as the number of hostages that Gaza holds goes down, the sort of pressure on Israel to start the war again goes up. In other words, the Israeli calculation is that it's not worth the lives of the hostages to not start the war again. And in particular, one of the political parties that was the main supporter of Netanyahu's government said that if you don't start the war again in 6 months, we're leaving the government and the government would collapse. So from Netanyahu's point of view, he had no choice but to go back and do it. And especially because there was no real progress made on the release of the hostages. The conditions of Hamas to release the hostages were that Israel gets out of Gaza completely and just lets Hamas, start from the beginning. And of course, Israel didn't want that at all. So that was the impasse. And, except for the relatives of the 24 remaining live hostages, the lives of the hostages have become less of a priority in Israel since so many of them have been released and exchanged already. So that's, I think, part of an ongoing situation. And the problem for Israel is that there is no victory possible, that they will not find the hostages themselves. And if they get close to finding them, the hostages will be killed by their captors. And number one. And number two, that they will never be able to defeat Hamas because Hamas has the network of tunnels that they've built and the amount of supplies that they've stored, especially since the ceasefire happened. It's been 2 months already. They've been able to recoup so many of their losses, to recruit so many more soldiers, and even to dig tunnels. The last hostages were released said that Hamas never stopped digging tunnels, even when they were being bombarded, even when Israel was putting all kinds of pressure on them. So it looks like a no-win situation, really, for Israel. And it just means that the war will just continue to drag on, really ad infinitum. So unless Israel goes in with boots on the ground and occupies every square inch on top, they still have to figure out how to get underneath the ground to eliminate the Hamas in the tunnels, and that is a very risky and difficult job to do. The announcement of the resumption of the war has led the other partner that Mr. Netanyahu had, the Jewish Power Party, to rejoin the government. It had quit the government because it opposed the ceasefire altogether. And now that the ceasefire is over, Mr. Ben Gvir, who is the leader of the party, a person who never served in the Israeli army because he was deemed to be too radical a racist to serve in the army, a person who was the head of the public security ministry and who ordered the prisons to stop treating the Palestinians badly and start treating them more badly. And a person who said that there's no such thing as a Jewish terrorist, that the Jewish terrorists who are operating in the West Bank can never be arrested for anything and should be let out of jail if they're already in jail. So it gives you an idea of the sort of extreme nature of this man and how his joining the government will lead to even more conflicts in the West Bank between settlers and the Palestinian population. In brief, that's on that score. One thing I found was really quite interesting. I had met somebody who had taken a trip to Ireland. And we all know how Ireland itself as a country is probably the most anti-Israel country in Europe, the biggest supporter of the Palestinians, one of the sponsors of the court case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. In a certain sense, it's a bit hard to explain the psychology of this, since obviously there's no close connection between Ireland and Israel. They don't border each other. They don't trade with each other. There's no shared history with each other. The only thing that they do share is having formerly been occupied or ruled by the British, and the Irish population is still quite resentful of the British for their centuries of rule or misrule. And, there was a time in the 1930s when this radical elements of the Irgun and the IRA corresponded together to see what they could do fighting the British. But ever since Israel became independent, and especially after the 6-Day War, Israel has been seen as the kind of Goliath in the Middle East, and the Irish always sympathize with the Davids of the world, and that's how they perceive things. And so, even though there isn't a large Arab population or Palestinian population in Ireland, the sympathies have always been with the Palestinians on the part of the Irish. Now, on the other hand, this woman who I was speaking with, she went to Belfast, which is in Northern Ireland, so that's still part of Great Britain. And Northern Ireland, as you all know, was a site of a terrible civil war in the 1980s called the Troubles, between the Protestants and the Catholics living in Northern Ireland. And Belfast, the capital, portrayed this struggle kind of on a daily basis out in the streets. So what she said, she visited Belfast and she was so surprised to see that in some places there were Israeli flags and "We stand with Israel" and all kinds of pro-Israel slogans. And this was in the Protestant side of Belfast. When she went to the Catholic side of Belfast, there were Palestinian flags and "Free Palestine" and all that kind of stuff. So in other words, the kind of classical competition or dislike, you could say maybe, of the two populations living together is reflected in the supporting of either Israel or Palestine in that conflict by those two sides. You should know that for the first time in history, the IRA won the elections, won most seats. The Sinn Féin party won the most seats in the Northern Irish elections. And so for the first time, then they are the largest party in the Northern Irish government or parliament, which has a very unique status and a way of operating. But it's all because of the shrinking Protestant population and the growing Catholic population in Northern Ireland. It was just funny for this person to see all kinds of Israeli flags in the middle of a place that you would think they would not be. And of course, vice versa, it's a bit less surprising since there are pro-Palestinian demonstrations all over Western Europe and in other parts of the world, in Australia and Canada and South Africa and all kinds of other places. So that was just an interesting factor, and we have to now expect that this war will continue on with casualties, of course, casualties on both sides, and it's hard to see where this can end. It was actually President Trump who sort of forced the ceasefire, and now his attitude is, well, let Israel do what it wants for now, and we'll see what happens later. So that's what's happened on that side. The other interesting development also happening today was a rebuke of President Trump from the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, because Trump had threatened to impeach any judges that voted against him. And in fact, there is this sort of constitutional crisis going on in the US, whereby the president thinks that he doesn't have to obey whatever the judges order. In the case of a judge ordering that a plane carrying migrants be turned around, he just said, no, I'm not doing it. And, basically, there was a Supreme Court judgment last year that said that the president has immunity over all acts he does as president, not as an individual, but as a president. And so really that was a carte blanche for him to say, well, I have nobody who can stop me. And since he's got the support of both the Senate and the House of Representatives for now, on the legislative side, there is no one willing to vote against him or to pass laws that he's not in favor of. So at this point, it looks like the United States is sliding into a kind of a strongman type regime where the courts are not a brake on the actions of the president anymore. And, as Trump said, this is only the beginning. So I think it's an ominous sign. The separation of powers between the executive, legislature, and judiciary was one of the key founding principles of the United States. And if it doesn't exist anymore, and the president has supreme power to do whatever he wants, and to fire anyone he wants, to force the government to expose or to expound his own beliefs as if they were the government of the United States' beliefs or the country's beliefs. This is all new. He wants to shut down the Voice of America, but in the meantime, he says the Voice of America should only portray America as Trump sees it, and anyone who doesn't would get fired. So, he's got the supreme power to fire everyone and who doesn't agree with him. And he's got well-placed informants all over the place to squeal on people who don't agree with him. And so the chaos that's going on in Washington now is really is the first time this has happened really probably in American history. Well, at least since the Civil War. During the Civil War, there was also this whole issue of people working for the US government who supported the South, who wanted to secede from the government. And so, you had people working for the government for a cause that was, in a certain sense, treasonous. But since that time, there hasn't been that stark division, we'll say, in the way the government operates. And this is the first time that this is happening. So the long-term effects of these are much more important than the short-term effects. And we'll find out, after the hurricane season starts, and there was no predictions of where it was going to land because they fired all the scientists in the National Oceanographic Institute. That's when kind of things will start to play out. In the meantime, America is this unstable country. The tariffs are still slated to be put into effect on April the 2nd, unless he changes his mind again. and the whole world's financial markets are up and down, and really it's a crisis of confidence, which is affecting now the United States economy, the Canadian economy, and pretty well the whole world economy, because the stock markets have been a reflection of the expectations of the future economy. The stock markets have been down since Trump took power. So I wanted just to leave you with that, since we know about these things, and to talk in depth about two places that have been in the news lately. And we'll start off with the Ukraine, because the president is speaking with Putin today. The two of them are trying to decide the fate of the Ukraine together, and without the presence of the actual Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky. And it's as if the two parties will together decide what will be the fate of the third party. So in and of itself, that seems to be an unequal balance, but so it is. So let's learn a little bit about the Ukraine. What makes it so special? What makes it so different? What is its role in history? And how did we get to this point? So I would like to speak about that for a bit. And then the next place I wanted to talk about in depth is Greenland, our neighbor, because the US wants to take over Greenland. And I think it's an interesting, probably one of the more interesting places in the world to focus on, because especially of the process of climate change and the effects it's having on that country or on that place. So that's what we'll do. We'll talk about those two things, and we'll see where we're at. To start with, the war between Russia and the Ukraine, or the war that Russia started against the Ukraine, started 3 years ago. It actually started much more than 3 years ago, but the current edition started 3 years ago. And the Ukrainians, despite some successes, sort of after 1 year, have been very gradually losing small bits of territory. And they just have lost pretty well all the territory that they themselves captured in Russia in a surprise attack where they invaded and took over a small piece of land on the northern side of the Ukrainian border. You might have heard that the Russians used a brilliant idea to defeat the Ukrainians in Kursk, which is the name of the province or the name of the region that the Ukrainians had occupied. The Ukrainians had set up, of course, a front and put soldiers, on the edges of where the front is. But there was an empty pipeline going through that area, and the Russians sent their soldiers through this empty pipeline, which was big enough for them to squeeze into. And so they were able to attack the Ukrainians from the rear and pretty well push them back to the border, the border where, Ukraine and Russia were separated since 1991. The Russians, of course, have been bombing Ukrainian infrastructure, bombing their power stations, bombing their supply stations. The U.S. has cut off aid to the Ukraine. The U.S. has cut off military supplies to the Ukraine. And the U.S. is wanting to have a ceasefire, but without Russia retreating from where they are now. So Ukraine, therefore, looks like in a pretty bad spot, since the U.S. was the biggest single source of their support and supplies and money. And, that's what all these negotiations are going to be touching on. So the Ukraine, first of all, to know where it is, it's in Eastern Europe. It's located in between Poland to the west, Belarus to the north, Russia to the east, and it has a coastline on the Black Sea. And on the south of the Black Sea, the south of the Ukraine would be Bulgaria and Romania, on the small sea coast that they have on the Black Sea. On the western side, they're bordered by Slovakia and, as I said, Romania, Bulgaria. So it's a kind of a land in the middle of Eastern Europe without really any large, we'll call it geographical boundaries. No big mountain ranges separate it from its neighbors. The Danube River, just in a tiny little bit in the south, acts as a border. So it's a kind of a more or less flat land with lots of good potential agriculture, good farming, and a climate which is in general kind of similar to our climate, but like the rest of the world, getting warmer as the time goes on. It was never an independent country. So, unlike many other countries that have been captured and then want to get their independence back, the Ukraine was never an independent country. Going back 1,000 years or so, it was really the kind of center of where Russia itself grew up. It was really the center where the Russian church got started and their whole Russian identity got started. It was in what we would call today Kiev in the Ukraine. And it converted to Christianity over 1,000 years ago when Greek priests came up from Greece to Christianize the population. And that is why the Russian and Ukrainians adopted the Greek alphabet and transformed it a little bit to suit the Slavic languages. But that's why they practice an Orthodox brand of Christianity, and they use the Greek alphabet as their national alphabets. In the sort of later Middle Ages, there was a very strong empire of a union of Poland and Lithuania. And that union of Poland and Lithuania for 200 odd years, from around the 1500s to the 1800s, they ruled over the Ukraine. You might remember that Poland and Lithuania are both Catholic places. And so the pressure on the Ukrainians to convert to Catholicism was very high. And the distinction between the rulers, who were like the Poles, and the Ukrainians, who were Orthodox, was very high, and religion played a very important role in this separation. There was a period where the Poles really tried hard to get the Ukrainians to convert to Catholicism, and some did, and formed the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is one of the exceptions in the Roman Catholic division, where they could use the Ukrainian language in their prayers instead of Latin. So this goes back now, I'm talking about pre-1795. And in that time period, going into those 1700s, the Polish people were the landowners in the Ukraine. The farmers were Ukrainians, but the Jews were the middleman between the two populations. They were the ones who collected rent for the landowners. They're the ones who owned small stores and businesses in the small villages. They were the ones who ran the alcohol business and the tavern business to supply the local people with those things. And needless to say, because they had no strength of their own, there was periodic attacks on them, especially in the 1640s by someone who's called Khmelnytsky, who was a hero of a Cossack, who was a hero of Ukrainian nationalism, because he was fighting against the Polish landlords, and the people caught in the middle were the Jews, who were massacred in their hundreds, if not thousands, thousands, I should say thousands, by the Cossacks, who also attacked the Poles, by the way. But see, there weren't all that many Poles living in what would be the Ukraine, but they were the owners of the biggest land holdings. The Hasidic movement started in the Ukraine because the Jews living out in the countrysides were, for the most part, uneducated and unsophisticated, and open to new messages by the founders of the Hasidism, who said that learning the Talmud was not the most important part of the religion, and being close to God on an individual basis was important. So they were very open to receive those kind of messages, and that's why Hasidism got started in those kind of rural sections of Belarus and Ukraine in the 1700s. Gradually, the Russians got stronger and stronger, and the Prussians, the Germans, got stronger and stronger. And by the end of the 1700s, Poland itself was conquered by and divided up by those three allies. In other words, Germany, Austria, and Russia. And so the Ukraine was part of these territories that were taken over mostly by Russia as a result of the collapse of Poland in the end of the 1700s. And when Russia took over all that Ukrainian territory, they inherited millions of Jews who had not lived in Russia up until that point. And Russia kept the Ukraine as an integral part of its territory. It introduced the Russian language. It kind of tried to Russify the people who were living there. And the city of Kiev, the capital, really became a kind of a half Russian, half Ukrainian city, even by the time of the Soviet Revolution. The Soviet Revolution took place in 1917, we all know that. And briefly, there was a period of kind of anarchy, and many of the places that were formerly part of the Russian Empire declared independence for a short period of time until the communist troops were able to finally take control, which, by the 1920, they managed to control all of the Ukraine. The opponents of the communists, called the Tsar's army, a lot of them tried to go south in southern Ukraine and try to kind of enlist the Cossacks as their benefactors. And they were defeated, simply militarily defeated by the soldiers from the Red Army. And so certainly by 1921, things had settled down all over the Soviet Union. And the Ukraine was actually given a kind of a national status for the first time in its history as the Ukraine by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union incorporated 16 different provinces, or we'll call them states, and the Ukraine was one of them. And as part of this incorporation, the Soviets also encouraged a kind of a national expression, so to win over the support of the people living in all these different places. And so they're the ones who enabled the Ukrainian language to have an official status, to have books published, to have newspapers published, and a whole series of cultural life, in the same way they did to the Georgians and to the Armenians and to Azerbaijanis and all the others, the republics in the Muslim parts of the country. So that policy of iron rule from Moscow was accompanied by a kind of a cultural flourishing of local cultures in order to win support of the local people. But of course, one of the principal jobs of the Soviet Union when they took over was to get rid of all private property. And so they nationalized everything that was in private hands, which included railways, included telegraphs, included all the land, most importantly, all the land. And the people who were independent farmers were forced to abandon their farms and to go live on sort of collective farms. And what that meant was an enormous drop of productivity of grain, because the farmers felt that, why should they work for someone else type of idea. And there were some climatic, bad weather issues going on in the 1920s. And because of the stress on the food supply, and because of Stalin's fear of Ukrainians resisting his rule, he decided that all Ukrainian farms' output would be confiscated and sent to Moscow, and the Ukrainians were left to starve in their numbers during the periods of the late 20s and early 30s. And this great famine is something that the Ukrainians feel was purposely caused by Stalin. And the Russians would say, no, it was just bad everywhere. And, everyone suffered. So that, famine is really kind of one of the markers of Ukrainian um, identity, we'll call it. When World War II started, the Germans invaded Poland, and then from there they easily moved into the Ukraine. And unfortunately, of course, for the Jews living there, they were murdered by the millions, not sent to concentration camps, not sent to ghettos, but just murdered wherever they were found by mass shootings and just massacres. And then it was something where it was, if people didn't go east and get away from the Germans, they pretty well had no chance to survive the occupation, because the Germans eventually occupied pretty well almost all of what we would call today the Ukraine. They were on their way to Moscow. They were on their way to Leningrad. They were on their way to what's called Stalingrad on the Volga River. So all of the Ukraine was incorporated into the German Reich. And there were Ukrainians who sympathized with the Germans, because these were people who were enemies of the Communist Party. They were enemies of the Soviet Union. They wanted to have some kind of a free status for the Ukraine, and they were hoping that by supporting the Germans, that if the war ended favorably for the Germans, that Ukraine would become an independent country. Now, among the people who were of this mind were Cynthia Freeland's grandfather. He ran a Ukrainian language newspaper in Lviv, and which supported the Nazis. And the explanation for all of this, including all those Ukrainians who fought with the Germans, were that they were trying to fight against the Soviet Union. They weren't really trying to help the Germans. But be that as it may, they were among the great helpers who helped exterminate the Jewish populations in any of the territories that were captured by the Germans. So not all the killing was done by the Germans. Ukrainians did plenty of it as well. So 1 to 2 million Jews in the Ukraine were killed and surrounding areas. The war ended, of course. The Soviet Union won the war. And there were, by the way, many, many Ukrainians who fought on the Soviet side. So they were. And if I had to guess, and I'm not for sure, I'm not giving you accurate numbers, but the vast majority of Ukrainians fought on behalf of the Soviet Union in that war. The Soviet Union, of course, ended up defeating the Germans. They turned the tide. They gradually kicked them out of the Ukraine. They kicked them, went into Poland, and the Soviet army went right into Berlin by 1945. So the Ukraine was reincorporated, of course, into the Soviet Union. And after Stalin died, Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was of a part Ukrainian family. And he did an unusual thing in 1954. He gave the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukraine. And the Crimean Peninsula is a peninsula in the Black Sea. Its population was really kind of very diverse historically, but Ukrainians were never a large proportion of its population. Most of the people living there by the time 1954 rolled around were Russian-speaking people, and there were also Muslim, Tatars. There were Jews. There were even Karaites living there again before the war. This sect of Judaism which rejected the Talmud. There were Greek people living there from the former Greek colonies that were spread all over the Black Sea. So it was a kind of a mix of peoples living there. And for reasons that are not entirely clear, but to try to win over the Ukrainian favoritism, Khrushchev gave the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukraine. And it became part of Ukrainian territory. Of course, all this didn't matter because everything was ruled from Moscow and the Soviet Union anyway. So none of these boundaries or none of these little, individual republics had any power whatsoever. But when Ukraine became independent in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine itself at that point, when it became independent, it was kind of, along with Belarus, the last, we'll call them states that kind of almost reluctantly declared independence when the Soviet Union collapsed. All the rest of the countries from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and all the Muslim republics, they all declared independence immediately. Ukraine and Belarus and Russia sort of formed a kind of what they called the Commonwealth of Independent States, a kind of a union, an economic union, and a sort of a military union. Not quite a political union, but they were the last holdovers to the great Soviet Empire, we'll call it like that. The population in the Ukraine for a very, very long time was always somewhat mixed. In other words, the eastern part of the country was Russian speaking. The far western part of the country was Ukrainian speaking. And the middle part of the country, where Kiev is, was kind of mixed. And when free elections took place in the Ukraine, the eastern part of the country, the Russian-speaking part, always voted for Russian parties, and the Ukrainian parts voted for different parties, and that was kind of the stability and equilibrium of the country after it was independent. The Russian Orthodox Church was still very important in the Ukraine, even though there was a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Because there were so many Russians there, that church really was, which owes its kind of loyalty to Moscow. That church was very strong in the Ukraine, even after Ukraine became an independent country in 1991. There was elections in the Ukraine in 2004 and in 2014, and pro-independence parties, pro-European, I should say, pro-European, pro-Western European, pro-EU parties won the election in 2014. And the fear in Russia was twofold. One fear was that this kind of democracy movement and pro-Western movement would lead Ukraine to move out of the Russian tent. The other fear was that the infection of democracy in the Ukraine would pass over to Russia itself and infect Russia, and therefore the rule of Mr. Putin and his predecessors would collapse, because Russia never really had a liberal democracy since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the fear was that if Ukraine becomes a liberal Western democracy, people in Russia are going to ask for the same thing. So that's why in 2014, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula, took it over. And I think I had mentioned once I had visited the Crimean Peninsula when it was under Ukrainian rule. And we visited a few different places, including Yalta, which is where the Western Allies met to plan out the end of the war in the 1940s. Stalin, Churchill, and Truman, I'm sorry, not Truman, Roosevelt. And the people living there said, we feel completely Russian, but we appreciate living in the Ukraine because it's a free country. And we would be better off if the Russians took us over economically, because the wages were higher, the pensions were higher, but they still liked the situation that they were in. Well, of course, there was a takeover of the Crimean Peninsula. There was a so-called referendum that was announced. And the referendum was, of course, 95% pro-Russian. And it's been that way ever since. Shortly after, the Russians also started to invade the Russian-speaking parts of the Ukraine. And that invasion has continued up until now. The excuse being that Russians wanted to protect the Russian-speaking minority in the Ukraine. And so they have taken over somewhere around 20% of the total Ukrainian territory on the east, all the places of which were once Russian-speaking. Of course, so many people left those territories since the war started, and Russia moved in its own citizens to live in those places. Russia gave citizenship to everybody living there and forced citizenship on the people living there. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to send their kids to school or receive any government help. So, we're at a point where maybe there will be a ceasefire, maybe there will be an understanding or an agreement where Ukraine gives up territories. All of these things are up in the air at this point. But the fact that they lasted so long is really quite a miracle. And so many Ukrainians, I said, they left. Many of them went to live in Europe, especially Germany. But a lot of them even came to US and Canada, and it's it's a kind of a tragedy that that unfolded because no one, neither the US nor the Europeans, wanted to commit troops to fighting against Russia. It did mean that it sort of united the Europeans in fear of Russia, because they say, well, if Ukraine falls, who's going to be next? And since the lack of support of the U.S. in weapons, the Europeans have come together to try to push more help going toward the Ukraine. But Russia has determined itself to say, we don't care what we lose, we don't care what it costs. We're going to pursue this war, and that's the situation there. So let me stop for 1 second and now talk about Greenland, because and I don't know if I'll be able to finish all that I wanted to say, but Greenland has come into the world's attention because Trump has said he wants to take it over. He offered to buy Greenland, and in my research that I was doing on this, I found out that the US in 1946 offered to buy Greenland for $100 million in that money. So they've always had their eye on that piece of territory. So Greenland is the world's largest island. It is, we know, it's a neighbor of Canada. It's really quite close to the Nunavut territory. It's 81% covered by ice at this point, and the ice sheet is melting quite dramatically. But still, the territory is covered by ice, and if all the ice melted that's in Greenland and flowed into the oceans would rise 24 feet all around the world. And just imagine how much ice there is there to raise the oceans, which cover 2/3 of the world's surface, by 24 feet. So it's really quite something. It also has the northernmost land point in the world. It's officially a territory of Denmark, an autonomous territory of Denmark, along with the Faroe Islands, another one. Its population is only 57,000 in the whole territory, a huge island with no people on it. 57,000 is, not even almost a quarter of Cote-saint-Luc NDG borough. The history of Greenland is really actually quite fascinating. People came from Alaska and from northern Canada to live there about 4,500 years ago, and there isn't any record of anyone before then. But this group of people kind of gradually died out, and the Inuit of Canada, that group of people, only started to move into Greenland somewhere in the 1500s. No, 1200s, sorry, the 1200s. But before that, there was a settlement of Norwegian Norsemen who came from Norway. These were Norsemen who came to settle on the Greenland coast. And they were there for 400 years, from 900 to 1300. And some of those same people, including Eric the Red, ended up voyaging over to Labrador and voyaging to Nova Scotia, and were the first European visitors to North America. The colony that they established there was a farming colony. Oddly enough, they were not a hunting colony. They weren't hunting the animals that lived there in Greenland, but they were an agricultural and fishing colony. And for unknown reasons, they just disappeared. They just completely disappeared by 1300. In the 1600s, the Danes, Norwegians, and Denmark and Norway were the same country in those days. So they came again in the 1600s. And in 1721, the Danish-Norwegian kingdom claimed Greenland again. They actually sent an expedition looking for the first settlers and not even knowing if they were alive or not. And, they found the remains of their settlements, but there were no people there. So since that time, since the early 1700s, that territory was claimed by the Danish Norwegian kingdom. And in 1814, Denmark and Norway separated, and Denmark got to keep Greenland. Why did the settlement disappear? Why, of course, the Norse people left all kinds of records of their settlement there. There's all kinds of physical remains as well. So there's no question that they lived there, but no one really knows for sure why the place was abandoned. The best theories are really two things. One has to do with climate change. And we know that in 1300, the world got colder, a lot colder, 5 to 6 degrees colder than it used to be. And that area, that is called the Little Ice Age that happened at that time. And since the Greenlanders grew crops, the crops couldn't survive. The Norse colonists, couldn't survive there. There were trees there at the time. There were growing grain there at the time. So there's no question that the climate got colder where these things became impossible. Or another idea was that the walrus, their biggest export was ivory from walrus tusks, and maybe the walrus disappeared, so they had nothing else to sort of live on. Another idea is that the Basque people who were fishermen may have visited and somehow did something to them, or more likely the Inuits who had come in to Greenland from Canada may have come in and defeated the Norse people. That's a much more likely explanation. One thing is for sure is that the Norse people living in Greenland did not adapt to the cold the way the Inuit did. They didn't have clothes like the Inuit did. They didn't have hunting equipment like the Inuit did. And there was intermarriage with the Inuit. So the people of Greenland today are really a mix between those two populations. But in any case, they really did disappear and were not heard from again. So to fast forward then to World War II, the Germans, of course, occupied Denmark, and Denmark then severed Greenland from itself. It said, okay, Greenland doesn't belong to us anymore, so we don't want the Germans to take it over. And the Americans took it over. So from 1941 to 1945, America actually ruled Greenland by sending troops there to prevent the Germans from taking it over. And so this, the idea that Trump has of America taking over Greenland has its historical precedence. Like I said, they offered $100 million in 1946. A treaty was signed with Denmark to allow the United States to keep military bases in Greenland, which they still have. Basically, until the Second World War, Greenland was really isolated. Denmark never encouraged trade with Greenland. They never encouraged tourism, of course. And it really was a very isolated place until the Second World War happened. They established the same sort of church boarding type schools for the Inuit that we had here in Canada and the US. They tried to urbanize and to, quote, civilize, unquote, the Greenlandic people. But by 1970s, the, kind of civil rights movement in Greenland started. The desire to become independent from Denmark, to reestablish Inuit culture, Inuit language, and it succeeded. In 2012, the Greenland version of Inuktitut was declared the official language of the country. Two different referendums were held, and in both of them, the people asking for more autonomy from Denmark won, including the last one, the last election, which was just held a month ago. The Separatist Party or Independence Party won that election. Problem with that for Greenland is that half of the money coming into Greenland comes from Denmark, from the social services, from welfare payments, from supplying teachers, supplying doctors, supplying social benefits, and fishing right now is not 90% of the Greenland economy. Of course, as the ice melts, mining is going to become much more important there. There's all kinds of minerals that are located in Greenland. The problem is that it's hard and expensive to get them out of there, including rare earths, which are so much in demand today. But as the ice cap melts and more land becomes open, there'll be more prospecting and more demand to, open up mines to exploit all this. But Greenland has a very strong environmentalist community. They want to keep Greenland green, so-called. And by the way, it was called Greenland by the Norse because they wanted to encourage people to come to live there. And by describing it as as a good land, they were hoping to lure settlers to come to live there, which didn't really work. 85% of the Greenland people opposed Trump's idea to take over the country. The ice melting is something that is really causing tremendous amount of worry in the country itself. Every year since 1996, more ice has melted and has been added on. And in 2021, and I remember hearing about this back then, rain fell for the very first time in history on Greenland's highest point. All that melting ice adds volumes of water into the oceans. It also cools off the oceans. And, if we take things to the very end, to the very extreme, it's possible, as you have maybe saw in the movies, that all that fresh water going into the Atlantic Ocean would disrupt or disturb the Gulf Stream, which brings warmth to Western Europe. And if that happens, all of Western Europe, from London to Paris, would all end up having a climate like Canada's. And on the other hand, if the Gulf Stream is diverted into Canada and doesn't make it across the ocean, then our territories bordering on the Atlantic would all warm up. So, but we're talking, they were looking at 1,000-year projections for this. So it's not something that's going to be happening overnight. Already the estimations are that the melting of the Greenland water has raised the ocean levels about 2.5 inches, which is really a very large amount, and continues to happen. It's the desire of the U.S. to take over Greenland is in a certain way being used by the proponents of independence of Greenland to say to the Denmark, look, we want you to give us what we want so that we won't sort of sell out to Mr. Trump. The idea that I had somehow, and no, I've never read it or seen it anywhere else, is that if Greenland separates from Denmark, it should join Canada because it's right next door to Canada. There is actually an island in Greenland that was part of a boundary dispute between Canada and Denmark. And that island, they ended up just relatively recently agreeing to divide the island in half. It's an island that's only about a mile long, so that Canada actually has a land boundary with Greenland or with Denmark. But it's an enormous piece of territory with almost no land, no people living in it. So that old adage, the old Zionist adage was, a people without a land for a land without a people. Well, Greenland is considered a land without a people, and it's no wonder that the U.S. would look to say, well, we'd love to take this over because of the huge gain in territory and strategic location in wealth and resources that are in that place. And, it could possibly happen under Trump's rule that he can make the Greenlanders an offer that they couldn't refuse. So if he had to offer them, maybe $10 million each to 57,000 people, that's really like peanuts in the economy of the U.S. And I'm sure a lot of the people would say, sure, why not? And Denmark still technically rules over Greenland from the points of view of national defense, foreign relations, that kind of thing. And it would be a kind of a way of setting the Greenland people against Denmark even more if Trump made that kind of a real generous offer. So, sometimes Trump gets these ideas that are out of the blue, but they have practical consequences. That's really kind of what I wanted to say. I've never been there. they have a capital city called Nuuk, which they changed the name from Godhab. They changed the name from a Danish name, a good harbor, to Nuuk. And they just expanded the airport there so that there are now international flights that can go there from Canada, from Denmark, I think from London. And, they're trying to develop tourism as another option for fishing to keep the population going. So it won't be long when you will see kind of summer trips to Greenland to view the glaciers and to view the the icebergs and things like that. And it'll be the next hot destination at some point or other. Quite predictable. So let me check. Okay, 3 o'clock. So pretty well that's what I wanted to present today. I'd like to, like always, ask people to give their comments, questions, suggestions, and I'm just so happy to be here to present these things to you. And to finish off by saying what I said at the beginning, we live in interesting times, and almost the world is almost like sitting on a kind of a what's the word, a tension that until things settle down, no one knows what Mr. Trump's next step is going to be, and he doesn't know what his next step is going to be. So it makes matters all the more serious. And the amount of worry is measured. There's something called a VIX. The VIX what's not instability index, it's the VIX worry index, something like that. And it's at its all-time high in the market. So people are just really, really not sure where the future is going to be. And all kinds of open possibilities are there. And sometimes a place which is quiet now may sort of change over just because Mr. Trump may have met somebody or seen somebody, and all of a sudden his ideas change over from one thing to another. So right now the pressure is on the Ukraine, and who knows where it may come tomorrow. It may be on Taiwan tomorrow. It may be it may be someplace else tomorrow. We don't really know. And Mr. Trump's support of Israel could also change, just as if he gets the wrong idea, meets the right person, he might say, oh well, you know what, now I'm supporting the Arab states against Israel. So it's just a bit insecure, the way things are going right now. So Angela, see what people have to say, or what they suggest, or what they ask. See if the people have some questions about this.
I don't see anything yet, but I did. Did you hear that Mr. Trump wanted to, if he bought Greenland, he wanted it to be renamed the red, white, and blue state?
I didn't hear that. That I didn't hear, but hey, listen, if he renamed the Gulf of Mexico, that he also he decided that there was an explanation display at Arlington National Cemetery, where all the heroes of the U.S. Wars are buried. He took away all references to women soldiers and to black soldiers, because he said this is DEI. He goes against DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion. And so Colin Powell, who was the first black general and the first black chief of American military, all reference to him as being a black person were taken away. And that's just part of the culture wars that he's fighting. But it's funny, a red, white, and blue state. Well, what it means is that if he takes over Greenland, he has no intention of respecting the will of the people who live there, who they have their own name for Greenland, which is like it's called it's an Inuit name, which really means the land of the local Inuits, the Republic of the local Inuits. That's what the that's what the official name is of that territory. So the official name isn't even Greenland anymore. It's I saw it somewhere, but it's just as we have Nunavut, they have another I can't remember it, but it begins with a K.
So I see that there's a few questions here. One is from an anonymous attendee. It says, how will Trump's tariffs with Canada probably end?
Well, they ended last time. Remember, he was in power for 4 years, and for 1 year he put tariffs on Canada, not quite so high. They were, I believe, 10% on Canadian steel and aluminum and some other stuff. And at that time, he never said anything, oh, that the tariffs are anything else but an economic tool. Now he's mixing things up. He's saying, well, it's because of fentanyl, it's because of illegal immigration, but all of those things are really meaningless because he only wants it as an economic tool. If the advantages outweigh the disadvantages in the long run, he will want to keep the tariffs. But all the economic theorists in history shows that tariffs don't work, that they cause more pain than they cause gain. And so therefore, they will, I believe, they will come off before the end of his term. And it may take a defeat in the 2026 elections for the House of Representatives to do that, and the Senate. It may take that to do that. There's very, very few business leaders who, if asked their honest opinions, say that tariffs are a good idea. Because one thing for sure, tariffs raise the cost of living, the cost of goods, the cost of supplies, to manufacturers. They raise the cost of goods to the consumer, and rising prices have all kinds of disadvantages to the United States because inflation has a kind of a mind of its own, and people, it means raising interest rates, raising the cost of housing, raising the cost of everything. So there is no quid pro quo. The supposed gains are that manufacturers will end up coming back to the US instead of manufacturing abroad, but that is so unlikely to happen in any large way, simply because it takes years and years of planning for any kind of large plant to move operations from one place to another. And they don't know in 4 years if a Democrat might win the election and change the tariff regulations. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the federal government does collect the money from the tariffs that are paid. That is true. It's a tax that they do collect. But if theoretically, if manufacturers do move to the States, then people will import less, and so the government will collect less tariffs. The other point that's never mentioned enough is that every country is putting counter tariffs on US goods going into those countries. So it means that US manufacturers of those goods, or farmers, they're the ones who are going to be losing because of it. So any gain in tariff income will be offset by smaller taxes and less business being created by the lack of customers for US goods abroad. So it's not a good idea. And as I have said before, the proof of that is looking at South America, which has had a high tariff regime for so long, and they, compared to what they used to be back in their heyday to where they are now, they would be so much further ahead without the tariffs that they've been charging. And tariffs lead to high prices, inefficient companies because they have no outside competition. They can make lousy goods and raise the prices, and that's really what happened in South America over the last 70 years. So it's not likely to be a successful idea, and therefore, at one point or other, business people will be telling Trump to get rid of the tariffs. And if ever he wants to lower prices, that's an instant way to do it.
So there is another question, but by an
Mhm.
anonymous attendee. It says, "Will Trump save the liberals in Canada?"
Such a great question, super question. And you might have seen the results of the last poll, and I was just reading one this morning that shows the Liberals ahead by 3 points. And I think this is really a shock of shocks. Or we have to say that we know that whenever a political party changes leadership, the support of that party goes up. Like when Harris took over from Biden, the Democrats had a small jump in popularity. So this would be the same thing. Um, it's really Trump really is the liberals' best friend because 90% of Canadians oppose what he says and what he does and what he wants for Canada. Mr. Poilievre has been identified as a mini Trump. There have been times when Mr. Poilievre himself has tried to kind of imitate Trump and to get closer to Trump. But it really backfires when Trump is seen as an enemy to Canada, and he is seen as that now. The polls seem to be showing that the Liberals are 3 points ahead. And if you look at this from a political point of view, since conservative votes are really strongly bunched and clustered and kind of concentrated in Alberta and Saskatchewan, in rural Manitoba, and in the interior British Columbia, those places are all so strongly supportive of the Conservatives that a lot of the votes that they do have there are, in a sense, wasted. And the Liberal support are more evenly spread over the whole country, so their vote is more efficient. So even if the two parties get the same number of votes, it's much more likely that the Liberals would get more seats because of how their votes are distributed. And remember that Mark Carney was just picked as a leader just, in the last 2 weeks. So there hasn't been a chance to mount any kind of good research against him or to find out what his weaknesses are or to exploit, like I said, what weaknesses he may have. He seems to still be holding some shares or options and shares in Brookfield Asset Management, a big, enormous company that he was once involved with. But, Carney is kind of a hard kind of target to hit because he is so bland and he is so uncharismatic, and he is also, highly educated, highly respected, highly experienced leader, but not a politician. He's never been in politics before, and as far as I can recall. And that might be a disadvantage for him. It might be a hindrance for him. He might get rattled, at the first time that someone throws an egg in his face. So we'll see. We'll see. Question is, will there be an election soon? And what I was reading yesterday, they were saying that he could actually call an election next week, which would be, kind of the earliest that he could do it. I was thinking maybe that he would wait until after April the 2nd to see if Trump puts tariffs on Canada. At that point, he could say, well, I need a mandate to fight against Trump, and therefore call an election after April 2nd. So it depends. But as you pointed out, as the polls seem to be saying, that the Liberals are definitely moving up. And as I think I mentioned last week, in a Quebec poll, the Liberals were ahead of the Bloc Québécois. And even the provincial Liberals, as moribund as they are, their numbers have moved up, also probably because of the Trump phenomenon. So he does ironically end up supporting his enemies because he's, such a polarizing character. But polls taken in the U.S. so far show that although most people disagree with what he's doing, they still support him. And, I always found this to be such a shock. But, that's how the American people feel, that he's a strong leader and they love strong leaders. But he's working hard against illegal immigration and they hate illegal immigration. And he claims to be improving the economy, which it isn't improving, but he claims it is. So many people just believe that. So far, in the polling, if an election were held right now, I think that the Republicans would win again.
I have a question for you,
Yeah.
Mr. Dwoskin. So Mr. Trump seems to be attacking like practically everyone around the world. Why hasn't he like attacked China as much? I mean, I know that he put a 20%
It's a
tariff on
super,
them.
yeah, it's a great question. Angela, you're absolutely right. And I've been thinking about that myself. It is true, he has a 20% tariff on Chinese goods, but tariffs on Chinese goods have been around now for quite a long time. And he hasn't really forcefully spoken out against China. And one of the reasons is that he respects strength and he sees China as being strong. He sees Russia as being strong. And in his mind, he respects that kind of thing. Um, he hasn't really talked. And another point is really that China is such a strong country today, the second largest economy in the world. It is still an enormous buyer of American goods. It's even a bigger seller of goods to America. And he may just not want China to threaten to stop sending things to the U.S. If China perceives that the U.S. is misbehaving. So he's been walking around, you're right, on kind of tiptoe around China at this point. But at some point or other, I think that will change because someone will talk to him and say, oh, look what China is doing. And then he'll say, oh, look what China is doing. And he might get back on their case. But up until now, I agree with you. He hasn't been on their case.
I don't see anything else yet.
Okay, well, we'll wait. We'll wait a bit. And one of the things that China has done, speaking of them, is that they've outsourced their production, their exports to the U.S. by shipping it through third countries like Vietnam, especially, or Cambodia, or Thailand, or Mexico. China has built plants in Mexico to make things there and send to the U.S. They've done the same thing in Vietnam. So in a certain way, they're kind of getting around the tariffs by using third parties. And so far that's worked, but Trump is trying to stop that as well.
I see a question that just popped up by anonymous attendee. It says Trump called Zelensky a dictator, and a few days later he denied saying it. Is he losing it?
Uh, you know, I think there's always two questions that come to mind when talking about him. Is that number one, he lies. The question is, does he himself end up believing his own lies? Or does he believe in the idea that if you lie enough in the same way consistently, that people will start believing your lies? This was a kind of a theory that the Nazis had in the 1930s. So just keep repeating the same lie, and people will start believing it. I think that one of the best examples of that is the claim that he won the election in 2020, and everyone knows for sure, tested 60 times in the court. Um, Audits of election results have taken place. There's no question that Trump lost the 2020 election. But he says he didn't. And therefore, about 30% of Americans think he didn't either. So it goes to show that his tactics of lying, of saying that, well, Ukraine started the war, since Americans don't really know much about foreign affairs. Because Trump said it's true, there you've got a third of Americans who say it's true also, and it is dangerous because fact checking is not something that Trump likes. The media like X, Meta, these formats that people get their news on, have decided that they don't want to do any fact checking either. So people will believe what they read and hear. Yeah, unfortunately.
There's nothing else that I see.
I just want to maybe just finish off. We've all heard about these two cases that Trump has decided to expel this one Palestinian student who was leading demonstrations in Colombia. And there was this nephrologist, kidney doctor, who went back to visit her family in Lebanon and now is not let back into the US because she was a supporter of the Hezbollah. And it seems to be his idea that if you think something and if you say something wrong that goes against him, that in and of itself is a crime, and therefore you could be expelled from the U.S. for that. And people have always felt that there's freedom of speech in the U.S. You're free to think what you want. You're free to say what you want. So within limitations, of course, but those limitations are not tied to expressing an opinion. And and the theory was always that you could think what you want, you could say what you want, but you can't do what you want. And the emphasis was on committing a crime by doing something. Nowadays, Trump is just saying, well, basically, if you in public say things that I don't like, and you're not a permanent resident in the U.S., well, I can just kick you out. And that idea seems to be catching on. So I think that's the next big clash that we will find is kind of around that whole freedom of speech notion, which was really the first amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guaranteed freedom of speech. And the question now is, well, what does that really mean? And that's what will be tested out, I'm sure, plenty of times in the courts. So, and the American Civil Liberties Union, even though they disagree violently with what people may think and believe, they're willing to defend people's rights to freedom of speech. And that goes for these two cases as well right now. So I want to thank you, Angela, and to thank all the people who are listening. And I'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening in on the TBS line and on Zoom. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.